Welcome to Self Principle. As always, I'm Dr. John Hashmi. Today's topic is all about getting a full understanding of what is a ketogenic diet. More importantly, what's it good for and what are the side effects you really want to know about. So with that, let's dive into the evidence. Now, a little background on this. Ketogenic diets have been around for a long time. It's really been around since the 1920s. They've been used to treat all sorts of things like epilepsy, which is what they're really well known for. But the concept is simple. It's really about a very low carbohydrate diet with moderate to low amounts of protein, and the rest of it is fat. So with that, there's different types of ketogenic diets that you want to understand. Let me give you a few of the basic definitions that you want to keep in mind. There's the classic ketogenic diet. Now by classic, there's two varieties. There's the 4-in-1 or the 3-in-1. These are just ratios. And by what that means is, if you look at the energy from fat in a classic 4-to-1 ratio, what you're looking at is 90% or so is coming from fat, 2 to 4% is from carbohydrates, and about 6 to 8% is from protein. In the classic 3-to-1, it's also about 85 to 90% fat, 2 to 5% is from carbohydrates, and 8 to 12% is from protein. So just a little bit more proteins. Then there's the modified Atkins diet version, which is really the one where people who are looking to have a little bit more flexibility, a little less fats, they do this version. So here you have about 60 to 65% from fat, 5 to 10% from carbohydrates, and about 25 to 35% from protein. So by increasing the protein content of it, you're still getting the ketone bodies going, but you're having a little bit more flexibility in what you can eat. There's a couple other variations that try to give you a little bit more carbohydrates in there, but just realize the big concept here, once again, is really getting a significant percentage of your calories from fat. All right, let's dive into ketogenic diets and the different types of diseases. Let's start with epilepsy. So what the data shows is that ketogenic diets since the 1920s have been done and used successfully for reducing epileptic seizures going on in patients, whether it's children or adults going on. Now, in this particular case, the study that we're explaining here, there was a randomized clinical trial. 75 people were in it. Age was 16 and above. And what they saw was that in terms of the completers of the study, people who stuck with the study towards the end, the number of people who had greater than a 25% seizure reduction was 167% higher in the arm that followed a ketogenic diet versus the control arm. So this is really important to understand that the data continues to be quite robust when it comes to ketogenic diet. Now, in terms of dropout, though, that's significant because 35% of the people dropped out of the study because they just couldn't handle the rigors of the ketogenic diet. And the biggest side effects were things like constipation, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and reflux. Now, GI side effects are something that's definitely important because in the ketogenic diet, they could be pretty intense. How about moving on to Parkinson's disease? In another randomized control study, this one lasting 8 weeks, had 47 people in there. It was comparing a ketogenic diet, 16 or less grams of carbohydrate a day, versus a low-fat diet, which was looking at less than 42 grams of fat a day. And what they found was that the ketogenic group had a much greater improvement in non-motor symptoms. Things like their mood was so much better, their cognitive or memory was better, fatigue was better, sleep was better, all in the ketogenic diet arm. Moving on to multiple sclerosis. In a 6-month single-arm open-label study, there was about 20 people in that study. What they found was that the people who were able to stick to the ketogenic diet in the multiple sclerosis treatment arm, they actually had a significant reduction in their BMI, in their total fat mass, in their fatigue, in their depression levels going on. Now, this is important because in MS, movement is limited. So all of these changes are happening simply from diet alone. But the side effects were also very significant in terms of the GI stuff that we talked about. When it comes to things like headaches, migraines, cluster headaches, in a prospective open-label single-arm trial, there were about 18 people in the study going on. Out of those 18 people, the group that was part of this low-carbohydrate ketogenic arm, out of these 18 people, 11 of them had full headache remission. Just think about that for a second. Following that ketogenic diet, 11 of them had complete resolution in their severe cluster headaches going on, and 4 of them had at least a 50% drop in their monthly attacks going on. So quite substantial. In another study with 35 overweight and obese patients who had migraines going on, in the folks that were following the very low calorie ketogenic diet versus the very low calorie non-ketogenic diet, the folks in the ketogenic arm had a reduction in migraine days by close to 4 less days of migraines per month. That's substantial as well. Weight loss was interestingly similar between the ketogenic and non-ketogenic group. And then lastly, when we look at memory, as we think about sort of the impact of ketone bodies on brain health, what we find is if we compare a high carb to a low carb study, and this one was a randomized study, 23 people, they all had age-related memory decline. They were all about average age of 70, give or take. And what they found was that on memory tests, the folks that were following a low carbohydrate diet did much better. So far it looks like as far as migraines, epilepsy is concerned, memory is concerned, it does look like ketogenic diet has something positive to offer as far as helping people out. Let's keep going. Let's look at some more data. Here's a meta-analysis that was done last year, 2020, and they were looking at 38 randomized control studies. The N was about 6,500 people, and they were really comparing low carbohydrate versus low fat. And what they found was that around 6 to 12 months, the low carbohydrates did better in terms of things like weight loss, triglycerides, and even HDL going up. Now let's jump topics and get into diabetes. Now diabetes is really devastating, and as you know, it's one of the biggest causes of kidney disease. Well, what's the data with type 1 and type 2 when it comes to ketogenic diet? So in this observational study of 11 adults with type 1 diabetes, they basically had continuous glucose monitors so they could check their sugars all day long. Now what they found was that 74% of the time, the people following the ketogenic diet were in the normal or recommended sugar range going on. And it was only in about 3% of the time that they were higher. Versus the folks that were following the control diet or the normal standard diet were significantly out of range and had marked variabilities going on. But, and here's a big issue, in terms of the low sugar episodes, the folks in the type 1 diabetic arm had about 6.3 episodes if they followed the ketogenic diet per week versus 1 to 2 episodes if they were following the standard diet. Now, low sugar episodes can be very, very dangerous, and there is concern about being able to successfully monitor for those so bad things don't happen. How about in type 2 diabetes? So in another study, 84 participants randomized study to either a low carb ketogenic diet or a low glycemic diet going on for 24 weeks. And what they found was that in the ketogenic diet, there was better A1C control, better body weight, meaning weight loss going on, and HDL went up more than it did in the low glycemic index. So far, once again, lots of studies that are talking about short-term benefits, whether it's diabetes, whether it's weight, whether it's migraines, that occur when you follow a ketogenic diet. If you look at fatty liver disease, in another randomized study, about 170 people going on, what they found was that in terms of the fat that's built inside the liver, people who were following the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, they lost 7 times more fat that was depositing in the liver than those who were really not following that diet. Then we get into this concept of cancer. Now, cancer is an ugly word. It's dangerous, it's scary. There's this concept of the Warburg effect. And what that really means is that there's an increase in sugar uptake and lactate production by most tumors. So if you could reduce the sugar uptake by tumors, you could lower their increase in them. Well, the ketogenic diet deprives sugar. So in a systematic review of 13 animal studies, what they showed was that 9 of those studies showed some beneficial effect of ketogenic diet on tumors. But remember, these were animal-based studies. In another meta-analysis of 11 studies, this time around humans, they couldn't come up with the same conclusion. So the data was very inconclusive in terms of the impact of a ketogenic diet on things like cancer going on. So far, we have talked a lot about all of the benefits that you can see with a ketogenic diet. But any diet that you pick, you want to think of not just the short-term effects. You want to think of the long-term effects. What are the benefits to your health? How can you make sure that you are not just optimizing your physique, your fitness ability, your memory, and your long-term health in terms of comorbidities like heart disease, cancer, and so forth. So when we look at diet quality, what we find is that anytime you do a restricted diet, like the ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet, there is a concern for vitamin deficiency, vitamins and minerals like thiamine, folate, vitamin A, E, K, B6, calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium. All of these vitamins can be low because of the fact that you're restricting so many of the foods. And remember, at the end of the day, it's always best to get your vitamins from food. Now, you can take a supplement, and supplements can certainly help, but you want to make sure that you always go for food as the first thing. The other stuff that there's a potential to miss out on whenever you start to restrict things is things like fiber. It's all of those beautiful phytonutrients that are found inside fruits and vegetables and whole grains that we know have so much benefit on things like your gut microbiome. Then there's this fascinating issue of glucose tolerance. Now, there was a study that was done. It was an animal-based study looking at mice, and what they were looking at was glucose tolerance. And so what they did was they fed these mice a ketogenic diet, and what they found was that they started to lose weight really fast. But at 22 weeks, the weight loss stopped. And not only did the weight loss stop, these mice started to develop significant amounts of fatty liver going on. And the problem with fatty liver is as you start to get fatty liver and as you get fat buildup inside your cells, you start to get insulin resistance. And that was the same thing they saw in this study, where there was glucose intolerance, meaning as they were measuring how long the sugar was lasting in the animals' bloodstreams, it was much longer going on. And also, their beta cells, which produce insulin, the size of the beta cells and the number of beta cells was also reduced at 22 weeks. Then here's a study that was done in healthy men. And in this particular case, they had 6 healthy men going on. They consumed a high-fat, low-carbohydrate type diet. And what they found was that the insulin-stimulated glucose oxidation was significantly lower after a high-fat, low-carb diet. What does that mean? That the sugar that these folks were consuming from their food was lasting around a lot longer. So what a high-fat diet, the danger there is creating insulin resistance throughout your body, and that becomes an issue. Now, there was an interesting study published this year that did a head-to-head trial of a ketogenic diet versus a low-fat plant-based diet. This was looking at 14 days or 2 weeks of each of these diets with a crossover design. What they showed was that in the low-fat diet, what you were really losing was a lot of fat in the first 14 days, but in the ketogenic arm, what you were losing was a lot of fat-free mass. So if it's not fat, it has to be water or muscle. And that's important because as you do a low carbohydrate diet, you tend to lose a lot more water than you do in terms of another diet. Now, water is not a good thing to lose generally. You can drink it back, but what you're really looking for is fat loss and is gain of lean muscle mass. When it comes to heart disease, what the data shows there is in this particular study, this was 12 CrossFit adults, average age 31. And these are really healthy, really fit folks. They did a 12-week ketogenic diet versus a standard diet. And what they found there was that, yes, they had a significant drop in their fat mass going on, 12.4% to be exact, versus the control arm. But the LDL cholesterol and then increased a whopping 35% going on. So it's important to understand that as you do these high-fat diets, your cholesterol goes up. One of the arguments is the type of LDL that's going up is the large, fluffy type. But what the data shows is both the large type and the small, dense type are bad for you. But the small, dense type is worse than the large, fluffy type. But at the end of the day, getting a lower LDL does matter. In terms of kidney health, what's interesting is with a ketogenic diet, there's a strong relationship to kidney stones. And the reason for that is a ketogenic diet creates a lot of acid inside your body, or a condition called metabolic acidosis. This actually leads to spilling calcium in the urine, or what we call hypercalciuria. Why should you care? Because hypercalciuria is a risk factor for forming stones. The other thing that happens is your body is able to prevent stones by having citrate in the urine. But if you create acidosis in the blood, it causes the kidneys to suck up all of that citrate inside the tubules in the kidney back into the blood. What does that mean? You get low citrate filtering to your kidneys. Citrate prevents kidney stone. Not having enough citrate and having increased calcium is a setup for forming kidney stones. So when you're dealing with a ketogenic diet, you have a much higher risk for forming kidney stones. When we look at kidney disease, the Nurses' Health Study with 3,300 women, what they showed was that the highest versus lowest animal fat intake was linked with 72% higher risk of microalbuminuria. That's a marked risk. And what is microalbuminuria? It's basically spilling protein in the urine. Now you have a barrier in the kidneys, and as the pressure on the kidneys occurs, the barrier becomes leaky and you start to spill protein. That protein spillage scars up the kidney and eventually it leads to dialysis. So the more animal fat intake you do, the higher your risk of microalbumin. Also, the folks who were consuming 2 or more servings of red meat per week, they had a 51% higher risk of microalbuminuria. So a simple thing to think about when preventing kidney disease is cut down your intake of fat, especially animal fat. Now, for any diet that you decide to do, there's one thing that's important to understand when it comes to things like cheat days. And this is really important. So whether you do an Atkins diet or you do a ketogenic diet, if you decide to have a cheat day, quote unquote, you can actually damage the endothelial cells, the cells that line your blood vessels a lot. In a fascinating study, they looked at 9 healthy males and they had them do 7 days of a high-fat diet. At the end of the 7 days, they gave them a drink of 75 grams of glucose. And so once they did that, they measured 2 things. One was flow-mediated dilation, or FMD. That's basically how well your blood vessels can open and relax and allow more blood to go through them. And second, they measured endothelial microparticles. These are particles that are found inside the cells lining your blood vessels. So as those cells die and break apart, these EMP particles get released. So what they found in this study was that after that drink, they had a significant increase in these endothelial microparticles, or EMPs, and they saw that those blood vessels didn't dilate as much. In other words, the flow-mediated dilation went down markedly. So if you're watching this and you're wondering, okay, well, there's so much data we've just gone through about a ketogenic diet. What is the bottom line? Can you sum it all up for me? Well, Michael Pollan has 7 words, and that's been my motto ever since I started my journey in nutrition, which is eat food, not too much, mostly plants. We have overwhelming data on the benefits of a whole foods plant-based diet. We know it's good for your heart. We know it's great for your kidneys. It's great for memory. We have more and more data coming around longevity. The longest living people on the planet have been following mostly or predominantly a whole foods plant-based diet for hundreds of years in the past, and they've seen really great results going on. So if you're thinking about it and you're somebody who says, look, I want to follow a low-carb diet, even then, the advice that I would give you is look at how much animal protein, how much animal fat you have coming in. Try to see if you can reduce that. Every step counts. You know, food is not just medicine, food is culture. And I want to shift you away from this idea of the perfect diet to becoming balanced, to becoming sustainable, to being humble about the fact that life is a journey and none of us have it figured out. So thanks so much for checking out this episode. And if you like it, I would love to hear your comments. Please share. And this would really help us to continue our mission to help people learn more about how to live their best life. Thank you.